The Esperance region is home to some of the oldest and most unique historical buildings in Western Australia. These buildings tell of the dramatic change that the colonial period brought to the land. Stories of community and conflict, tragedy and hope, and stories of survival in some of the most unlikely places. The Israelite Bay Telegraph Station is a grand, sprawling building in an isolated and forbidding place, hundreds of kilometres from the nearest town. While it's now abandoned, this building was once the centre of a bustling little settlement and a vital link in a grand scheme that connected Western Australia to the world. The early years of colonial Western Australia were marked by great difficulties with communication. With huge distances between most of the colonial outposts, few roads, and dry, often waterless terrain between settlements, most correspondence was transported via coastal ships. This meant that the Europeans who'd settled in remote areas often had to wait for many months for letters or news from other places, which took its toll. In the early days of their time in the Esperance area, Andrew Dempster recalled a time where they didn't receive any communication from the outside world for 11 weary months. The telegraph was invented in the 1830s, and in 1844 the first telegraph was sent using Morse code. The first telegraph line in Australia was built in 1854, by which time telegraph lines were coming into widespread use in Europe and America. By 1868, Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide were all linked by telegraph, but Western Australia lagged behind, connecting its first line between Perth and Fremantle in 1869. After Frederick Weld was appointed Governor of colonial Western Australia in 1869, he undertook several tours of the state on horseback, covering 2,000 kilometres in his first 6 months in office. This impressed on him the isolation of the various settlements in the colony, and he became an advocate of telegraph lines and improved transport. In 1872, the telegraph line from Perth to York was completed, as well as the line from Perth to Albany. In 1873, after the overland telegraph line connecting Adelaide to Darwin and then to Java via an underwater cable was completed, the West Australian Government took action, authorising funds for an East-West Telegraph Line in 1874. This line would go from Albany to Eucla, connecting to the line the South Australian Government was building from Adelaide. On New Year's Day 1875, Governor Weld erected the first pole in Albany. This section of the line would cover 1,290 kilometres through mostly unsettled land and would take 7,000 telegraph poles. It was a huge feat for the newly formed WA government, which committed almost a quarter of the state's yearly revenue to the project. The initial stages progressed well, with the line reaching Bremer Bay by October of 1875 and Esperance Bay the following year. Those two stations were opened in March and September of 1876, with 15-year-old George Stevens arriving in Esperance soon after to commence work as the first station master. As the land was uncleared, barely surveyed, and had few European settlements at the time, building the line was a formidable task. The jarrah poles used were shipped to landing places along the route, then delivered to the construction team. It required around 16 poles per mile, each being a 14-foot jarrah post, so carting them was a significant undertaking. Guides were employed to go ahead and scout out the route, one of whom was Kokar man Tommy Windich. Tommy was a police tracker and guide who accompanied explorers John and Alexander Forrest on various expeditions, becoming well known throughout Western Australia. While in the Esperance area working with the telegraph construction crew, he contracted pneumonia and sadly died in February of 1876 at the age of 36. All three of the Perth newspapers of the time carried news of his death. John and Alexander Forrest organised for a headstone to be erected over his grave. East of Esperance Bay, progress on the telegraph line was slower. The next station was to be erected at Point Culver, but due to the lack of a safe harbour near that location, Israelite Bay was chosen instead. Israelite Bay was named by early European visitors to the region, most likely the Dempster brothers, on their expedition of 1863. The name is thought to relate to a tribe of Aboriginal people they encountered who practiced circumcision, after the Israelite people known for the same practice. Yvonne Green is a Naju elder whose ancestors have strong connections to Israelite Bay.
Naju people and some other Aboriginal language groups, they had a big storyline and they mainly went from the big rocks to each other. The main water spots, they knew where they were, and that's where they walked from. In those early days, there was a lot of different language groups doing all their initiations and tribal stuff, and that's where they sheltered mainly, where the rocks are, because they know that there was water. And other groups, Noongar people, and the Muning people, Naju people, and some of the Kundalini people at that time, they probably would all linked up. They would have ceremonies. That was their way of living and doing things. Naju name for Israelite Bay is Jiddlup. Being close to the sea, the food is plentiful, and water, they dug their wells.
The arrival of Europeans to the area caused big changes to the way Aboriginal people lived.
Would have interfered with a lot of their daily activities, what they used to do, their ceremonies and marriages, and Aboriginal people started to move away because everything started changing. The laws come into place, and the ones that didn't understand, they either got shot or things happened to them, and a lot of friction, and fair-skinned babies came along.
The first telegraph station was built on a rise near the big white lake that was called Terrakandilla by the Aboriginal people. The initial telegraph building at Israelite Bay was constructed from weatherboard and consisted of 4 small rooms, each about 11 by 9 feet, around a central passageway. Cooking and washing were done outside in makeshift shelters. It was opened on the 5th of December 1876, and the modest building served as an office, storeroom and house for the station master, linesman and assistant for many years. The original station was replaced by a much larger and more grandiose building several years later. Trevor Bale is an amateur historian who has spent many years going to Israelite Bay, conducting cleanups and general maintenance.
Hi, honey, I'm home. Back in the day, it's always, your food, water, shelter, you pick out your main things to make life easier for yourself. So there's ample supply of fresh water at Israelite. If you know where to get it, you can get it. It's fairly well protected. It's not too bad for the area. The bay has an offshore reef that gives protection, so you can judge what the sea's doing and have protection to be there. Definitely not protected on some days. A very dangerous area really, and it's an open sea. So if something goes wrong, you're on your merry way with an offshore breeze. High risk area, big waves, big seas. They've been pretty iffy sometimes with the old sailboats.
During the building of the telegraph line, there were no jetties available along the coast to unload the ships delivering the poles and line to the construction crews. Supply ships had to get as close to shore as possible, often in rough seas and unprotected bays, and then float the jarrah poles onto the beach. This was a dangerous process, and while unloading at Point Culver, one of the crew members was trapped under the floating poles and drowned. One of these ships, the schooner Mary Ann, was wrecked while sheltering from a storm off the coast of Israelite Bay in 1876. Two more ships, the Twilight and the Bunyip, both cutters loaded with poles, telegraph cable, insulators and workmen's tools, were both wrecked on the same day in May of 1877, when a severe gale blew both ships onto shore at the eastern end of Culver Cliffs, where they were wrecked and their cargo impossible to recover. The crews of both ships survived and walked the 275 kilometres to Israelite Bay. The equipment carried by these two ships was said to be enough for 100 miles of the telegraph line, setting progress back by 6 weeks. The next station on the line after Israelite Bay was at Ayer's Sand Patch. From Point Culver to Ayr, cliffs rise nearly 100 metres above sea level, and the poles had to be hoisted up the cliffs using a pulley system. The limestone ground made erecting the poles difficult, and the workers had to drill holes in the limestone as well as sometimes pile rocks around for increased stability. The Ayr station was opened in July 1877, and towards the end of that year the line eventually reached Eucla, covering a distance of 1,290 kilometres from Albany. On the 8th of December, with great fanfare, the connection between Adelaide and Perth was completed. A flurry of congratulatory messages were sent between the colonies, with Sir Harry St George Ord, the Governor of Western Australia, announcing to the Governors of South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, "It is a subject of sincere congratulation that all the Australian colonies are now connected by telegraph. May it bring the respective colonies into closer union, both socially and commercially, and thus contribute to their natural prosperity."
This here just changed Australia totally. adjoin states. That is just legendary, you know. And as humans, we've got to communicate. So a European in a strange country and no communication. So the telegraph line just had to sort the communication issue for everybody. They would have had zero communication until they found a out camp of some sort, you know, where someone set up their livelihood. Getting to here to this building, there would have been someone here to be able to help them sort out what they're doing and send a message, because you can send messages from here the same as receiving a message. So to be able to do that, well, you know, hi mum, I'm okay, you know, basic stuff. So communication was the key, and that's why it changed Australia. Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
In these pre-Federation days, WA used international Morse code, while South Australia used American Morse code. This meant that the telegraph operators sat opposite each other with a wall between them representing the border. Each message had to be decoded and passed through a pigeonhole in the border wall. As South Australia was already connected to Europe via submarine cable to Java, this meant that WA now had a telegraphic connection to Europe. This was not without a significant cost though. A telegram from Western Australia to Europe was nearly £1 per word.
Our culture makes us strong, and our culture is our way of education. European have their books, but we have our stories and our dances and the significant places on country. Back in history, there's the traditional way, message sticks, and leaving stories behind in the caves. And then as they become more modernised, family would give information about families.
The ability to communicate by telegraph could literally be life-saving, as John Sharp, working in partnership with the Ponton brothers in the area, found out. On one occasion, the Pontons were working at Point Malcolm while John Sharp stayed back at Pine Hill to do some work on their camp there. William returned to Pine Hill to find John extremely sick and unable to walk, so he rode to Israelite Bay and telegraphed a doctor in Albany, the closest at the time, who determined that John had scurvy. Fortunately, there was a ship in the bay, and the captain gave William some lime juice and fresh vegetables for John. William rode back to Pine Hill immediately, and John soon made a full recovery.
So most into here was ships from Albany, servicing Albany to Esperance to Malcolm. The Pontons were down there, so so the ship would pull in and do their little drops and then to here. So that ship would be your mail, so you'd be ready with your mail to send back the other way. You'd have an idea when sailing ships were coming, but you were ready. It's not going to sit out there in a rough sea waiting for you to write a letter to Nana.
There were several station masters at the Israelite Bay Station, including H. Sterling, Mr. Carriage, George Stephen and Frederick Barwick. The first linesman was John Paul Brooks, of the Brooks family that later established Balbinia. During the time that Brooks worked for the telegraph line, he built a cottage for his mother and sister near the station, which they called Waratah. In 1884, Brooks stopped working as a linesman, and he and his mother, Mrs. Emily Brooks, moved to a property 100 kilometres inland that they called Balbinia. Sarah Brooks, John Paul's sister, stayed on at Waratah and was a valuable member of the community and a gifted piano player.
There would have had to have been people that were very resilient, self-entertaining. Sarah's piano would have got a fair old belting, and this building would have been a beautiful place to be meeting. And imagine some of those people coming in by a boat to get here to do, you know, to work here, say. Well, they got their nice big dress on and they've got to try and get on a boat and someone row them in, and then they'll go ass up in the ocean wave getting off, you know, oh, hello, you know. So it would have been pretty tricky. In amongst all those people, they'd all have individual skills and they all supported each other to get through their daily chores. You'd have to have a fair setup of people to keep this place running. You know, like linesmen, you'd have to have a cook. People that could do the job in here of sorting, passing on messages with the old do-do-do. Good postmaster. That is always the hardest part when you're in charge of people, is how do you manage your people so everybody is feeling that they're responsible, appreciated, and are going to, say, sit in this big room behind me here. There would have been a sort of big table in the middle for sorting mail. Fairly intense. You know, imagine receiving those messages first time east to west and west to east. So some of those messages would have been fairly important, detailed, and they all of a sudden were a part of that. I don't think most people in the modern world today would be able to do that and keep their mouth shut, you know, like that's pretty major. You would have had to be a fairly upright person in the community, pretty moral person, I would think.
After the Brookses left in 1884, the Cook family moved to Israelite Bay, and John Cook took the position of linesman. John was originally from Toodyay, and he came to Esperance Bay in 1877 to work for the Dempster family, along with his wife Margaret née Sinclair. Two of Margaret's brothers, James and Lawrence Sinclair, also came to Esperance in the early days of the town's history. Lawrence had been a shepherd for the Dempsters and was one of the first European residents of the region. James had worked for the Post and Telegraph Department from the time he was 13, and he eventually became the station master at Esperance in 1886. By the time John and Margaret Cook moved to Israelite Bay in 1884, they had 5 children, and they would go on to have another 7. The Cook family built a limestone cottage that they called Glencoe.
12 children were raised in this little cottage. 12 children, you know, that's out here, that's a big ask, mentally, physically to handle. One thing about the old days, they were all fairly short, you know, everything's short. I think it would have been very tough for the women, as you know, all those things to have to handle and challenge. Midwife would have been busy, whoever was being a midwife, and obviously someone had the skills there.
In 1883, the family went on to live on a lease of land they'd been granted by the Dempsters, which they called Noondunya. The gold rush that started in 1893 very rapidly brought new arrivals to Western Australia, boosting both the population and the revenue of the colony. With this increased prosperity, plans were made to replace the small Israelite Bay Telegraph Station with a new stone building. First, a jetty was constructed in 1894, with a bond store and goods shed attached, at a cost of £1,758. Then, in 1895, A.L. Payne's tender of £2,372 was accepted to build the new telegraph station. The building was completed within a year, boasting 12-foot limestone walls, spacious rooms, 4 monumental chimneys, and many other elaborate finishes that gave this isolated station a regal feel. The public and mail room had 3 tall windows along one wall. The station also had residential quarters for the station master and single men's quarters for other staff. The building was designed by well-known architect George Temple Poole, who also designed other prominent buildings such as the Perth Railway Station, Albany Courthouse, Fremantle Arts Centre, and several other telegraph stations on the East-West Line.
Awesome effort, you know, to think this is what they did out here. Pretty sort of major build place. It's not just slapped on, it was made to look pretty, you know, functional and pretty. Verandas right around it. Out the back, battery room out the back there, and there's copper and those sort of things. Soda vents up all around the top for that. There's a cellar, and that would have been handy back in the day. You know, refrigeration wasn't the option. Several rooms over the other side for your bedrooms, and the fireplaces there are one fireplace does 2 rooms, so trying to, probably factor that limitation of good firewood. This room's the main hub of all that sorting and doing. On the right here is where you posted your letters. 3 holes there, so if you picture your way out here in the middle of nowhere, but you'll just pull up out the front and post your letter and walk on. So quite funny seeing that. People would have been happy to see people, like, well, I've travelled on my trusty camel for a month, and I'm just going to pop my little letter in here and carry on into the wilderness.
Another family living at Israelite Bay was the Dimer family. German immigrant Henry Dimer and his wife Topsy moved to Israelite with their 2 children in the late 1890s, initially renting the old weatherboard telegraph station as their home. They were married there in 1899, with John and Margaret Cook in attendance. Henry built a 2-bedroom limestone cottage with a kitchen, completing it by the time the couple's 3rd child was born in May 1901. The Dimer family used this house for many years as their base on the coast, even after they'd moved further inland.
How's that?
But now only ruins remain.
Yeah.
My family connection would be on my father's side, the Graham family, and also on my mother's side, the Dimer family. My mum was born at Balladonia and my dad was born round about Pine Hill. They were just born in the bush. My mother's father was Jacob Dimer, and he had 2 wives. One was Jessie Rule, that's my mother's mother. My father's side, his father, John Walter Watson Graham, was the son of a postmaster. They was responsible for the telegraph. They ran the post office at Euclid. They were really high society people. They came over from England, all these educated family, and they had all the properties, all the lands. John Walter Watson Graham. He married Molly, an Aboriginal lady. She was a Nudgee. 1835, Yeah, he played a big role in helping the Nudgee people, helping with the work and helping record history and just being a good person. I feel he had a love towards the Aboriginal people and the kindness. My father, Robin Graham, he worked at Israelite Bay in his younger days and he was a shepherd. They looked after sheep and they made their little fences and yards out of bush and whatever. They didn't have wire or anything like that, they just had bushes and made do with what they could. Those days you had to live off what you could get and they had very little, no money at all. They lived very simple life, maybe a tin shack, maybe a tent or a bit of bush put together to make a little shelter. They had to travel around and then later on when he got a camel team, he carted all the wool from the stations around Balladonia area and took it down there so they can send it off.
The 1890s were the heyday of the telegraph line. During these years, a community grew around the Israelite Bay Telegraph Station, with around 20 employees living at the station. There were up to 150 people living in the surrounding district, as recorded in 1899.
In stages it would have been lonely, but I think they would have made it fairly entertaining for themselves to warrant staying, because the people that were here for a decent amount of time. But life would have been still pretty tough, still fairly lonely.
The gold rush boom increased the use of the telegraph line, at a time when its age meant it was facing increasing maintenance issues. The position of the line along the coast didn't help matters, as the sea air wreaked havoc on the wire. The long distances the linesmen had to travel through difficult terrain, as well as the occasional bushfire in the area, added to problems with keeping the line open. In May of 1895, the West Australian government reached a decision to continue the Perth line that had reached Coolgardie in 1894 through to Eucla. This new line went south to Dundas, then east to Balladonia, Ayr and Eucla, immediately relieving the pressure on the coastal line. Around this time, Eucla was one of Australia's busiest stations, receiving up to 600 telegrams daily. In the 1920s, a completely new telegraph line was built along the Trans-Australian Railway line, and the old telegraph lines and stations became obsolete.
Road was starting to happen. The line changed direction and you didn't need the ocean to get the materials here. So distance was shorter, less line maintenance, less remoteness for everybody to be trying to live out here and answer all those problems of communities and all that stuff. So once that happened, not needed. Once it was shut, well then, you know, it would have been moving inland to, you know, other inland sheep holders or, you know, down the Thomas River, anywhere there to try and get work and survive, because the money would have dried up here when this shut. They would have had to dig pretty deep what to do.
After the telegraph station closed down, the buildings at Israelite Bay were abandoned, and later the timber and iron were removed for use in other buildings. Despite this, the grand old station is still standing. The jetty was utilised by the Dimer family and other pastoralists in the region for many years, but it too is now in ruins, with only a small fragment remaining. Along with the remains of the small settlement that existed in the area, there are also 5 grave sites at Israelite Bay, including linesman John Cook, who died in 1912, and John Healy and Thomas Brass, who were both postmasters at the station. Despite the remoteness and difficulty in accessing it, Israelite Bay is a popular destination for locals from surrounding towns who have ventured out over the years to fish and explore the beautiful bay that is a calving ground for whales. The grand ruins of the station are still standing, thanks to the efforts of dedicated locals such as Trevor, who have worked to protect and preserve the structure.
We should be proud of our past. We should be proud of this. If you don't understand where you've come from, how do you know where you want to go to? And our problem we've got today is it's just moving very fast and we don't want to know about the past. If we don't know what we did here, how can we better down the road? It's as simple as that. As a tribe, we need to start looking back at the past and go, well, they did it a lot tougher than us, so I've got it pretty good. Do we need all this other stuff to live now? But back in the day, they did this with just grit, and it worked, and it changed Australia.
My dad used to always talk about it with the other elders, laugh and joke about the good times and the hard living out there. That was life. They were happy, they were all together. See, my mum was full blood and my dad was fair skin. So with all our children in our family, we're all different shades. And there's all different races of people now in Australia. Australia is big, there's plenty of room, and we can all live together. I'd like to see everybody working together, looking after the country, looking after the land, and making sure that there's a future for the next generation.
The telegraph line brought dramatic change to Western Australia, and the Israelite Bay Telegraph Station stands as a striking reminder of that time period and the resilient men and women who worked on the line. The isolation and grandeur of the place give testimony of just how difficult a task building and staffing the telegraph stations would have been. While the line has long been superseded, the beautiful old building remains today, a grand memorial to the past.